Okay, I think we should start. My name is Robert Toombs, and I'm president of the RCA. We're pleased to present tonight our Passages 7.0 lecture with Kevin King. I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. The Royal Canadian Academy of Arts acknowledges that our offices, located in Ottawa, are on the unceded ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. The RCA recognizes the Algonquins as customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. Je suis Robert Toombs avec l'Académie. C'est avec plaisir que l'Académie présenta Passage 7.0, une conférence en ligne de Kevin King. L'Académie royale des arts du Canada reconnaît que ses bureaux à Ottawa sont situés sur le territoire ancestral non cédé de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe. L'Académie reconnaît que les Algonquins sont les gardiens et défenseurs traditionnels du bassin hydrographique de la rivière des Ottawa et de ses affluentes. Nous saluons leur longue tradition d'accueil dont bénéficient de nombreuses nations dans ce magnifique territoire et nous nous engageons à défendre et à promouvoir la voix et les valeurs de notre nation hôte. I'd like to just give a very brief bio of Kevin, our distinguished presenter. Kevin King is a typeface designer, typographer, calligrapher, and type researcher based in Canada. After working at Toronto's Coach House Press and Canada Type, he completed his master's degree in typeface design with distinction at the University of Reading in 2018. Établi au Canada, Kevin King est concepteur de fontes, typographe, calligraphe et chercheur en ce domaine. Après d'avoir travaillé à Coach House Press et à Canada Type à Toronto, il a obtenu une maîtrise en conception typographique avec mention très bien de l'Université de Reading en 2018. So I'm very pleased to present Kevin King, and over to you, Kevin.
Oh, thank you very much, Robert. And thank you everyone for joining the talk tonight. I'm really looking forward to giving you this talk on the Syllabics project that I've worked on with Typotex over the past 2 years. And what I'll do is I'll pull up the presentation. And the first thing that I just want to say as we get started is I'm going to give my presentation and it'll maybe take about 20 to 25 minutes. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to open up the floor to questions for a Q&A session, because I think that it's, especially discussing a topic like this, it's really nice to have a room for discussion, fruitful discussion. So if you have questions or if anything comes up during my talk, if you could please enter your questions into the chat. What I'll do is I'll take a brief moment to review them after I'm finished delivering the presentation. And then I can have a curate some of the questions. I'll try to answer all of them as best I can. But we'll open up the floor to discussion at that point. Okay, I'm going to share. All right. Everybody sees the presentation on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so I'll get started. And I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement as well. Oops. So I'm speaking to you tonight from the city of Toronto. And I want to acknowledge that where I'm speaking to you from is on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat peoples, which is in the traditional territory covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And today the city is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So what I'm going to be speaking to you about tonight is the Typotheque Syllabics Project. And in particular, I want to share a little bit about the methodology that I undertook in order to work in collaboration with language keepers across Canada, across different Indigenous communities, to address both technical barriers that they were facing with their syllabics writing system, as well as looking at addressing local typographic preferences across the many different communities that use the syllabics in North America. And just to share a little bit about some of that process. So that involved some work at the Unicode or the text standard level. And it also involved, of course, addressing those local typographic preferences, identifying them, documenting them. And throughout this entire process, the key to what made this a successful project and an impactful project was a process of collaboration between myself, working with the Indigenous communities in a very active way. So I'm going to share a little bit about that methodology. I'll present some of the different components of the project. I'm going to also share some next steps that we're working on. So how our work isn't finished. In fact, it's ongoing, which is a great thing. And also I'll share some issues that exist in a more general context for Indigenous communities in Canada. And then I'll give you a showing of the final typefaces, talk about the final solutions a little bit, and then we'll go on to the Q&A. So in May 2020, I was in contact with Peter Bilak of Typotex, and we started discussing the idea of working on a project on the Canadian syllabics. And it was really Peter's idea and guidance where he said, I think that what we need to do is if we're going to take on the project, we need to approach it in a comprehensive way where we look at all of the communities that use syllabics and address their local typographic needs and preferences, as well as look into barriers that they might be facing. And of course, I thought this was a great idea. And so we came to an agreement to work together and began conducting research, which was both a process of historical and contemporary or analyses there of contemporary and historical materials that were available, as well as reaching out to local Indigenous language keepers across the different communities. So this process first began with doing something like the image that you see in front of you here, which was documenting where exactly are these communities located, and what is the geographic scope, or what, more or less, in fact, what is the actual scope of undertaking a project like this? Which communities use syllabics? Because of course, not all Indigenous communities, both First Nations and Inuit within Canada, use syllabics. Some only use a Latin script or a Roman orthography. So first identifying those communities that use this writing system, doing an initial documentation, and then reaching out to speak with language keepers after we've understood sort of what a general scope of the problems might be that the communities are encountering. There. And so a lot of this research involved historical analysis, as I was saying, so understanding where the writing system came from, the historical patterns of the communities that have been using the syllabics since the 19th century, and getting an understanding of how the system worked. So doing analysis of the typography, and then also identifying the issues. So I think that what's really useful is a very quick crash course in syllabics, because it might be a writing system that not many people are familiar with. I think it's valuable. So the syllabics writing system, from an orthographic level, works on a principle of rotation to represent the syllable structures in the languages that are using them. So for some languages such as Cree and Ojibwe, there will be 4 different vowels that are used, and they contain consonant. The language contains many consonants, and so the vowels are represented by a pure closed triangular form that you see here. You might think of this like a Greek delta that's rotated across 4 orientation positions. The entire orthography follows this orientation scheme in order to inflect the vowel of the consonant that's being represented. So, for instance, this would be a typical base syllable, phi, but if its position changes, its orientation changes, it would inflect the vowel of that consonant. So, phi, fo, fe, fa. And so this might express it a little bit better. And then we would consider these large characters here in orange to be a syllabic character. Now the orthography is also made up of small characters that we call finals. And what they represent is a pure consonant, which does in fact occur across all of the languages, where there'll be pure vowels, consonant vowel clusters, which are the syllabics, which are rotated, and there will be pure consonants as well. So you could think of these as superscript versions in some situations, depending on the language and its orthography in the community. They might be superscript versions of the larger syllabics, or in some situations, such as Western Cree communities or Western Ojibwe communities, they won't actually follow the base syllable that they represent, but it still functions the exact same way. And what you typically see if you're a user of the system is you have your series. So you have ke, ki, ko, ka, and then ke, which is just the pure consonant in that series. So that's just a little crash course, and I think it's useful for providing context towards some of the concepts that I'll discuss as I go through and explain the project, because these concepts are inherent to the writing system. So one of the major elements of this project that we undertook that I had mentioned that was important for us to do is to prepare an analysis of the local typographic preferences and what the scope of those local typographic preferences were across the different communities. And I'll talk a little bit about this ties into the Unicode work that we did, but it's also separate from that. Now the syllabics are represented in terms of a digital text encoding by what is called the Unified Canadian Aboriginal Syllabics. And this is the encoding representation for the syllabics. And this is an important factor. All the languages that use syllabics are represented in digital text by UCAS. We call it UCAS for short. And this is an encoding, and this is the entire encoding you see in front of you that represents all of the languages in digital text. Now, it's a very large encoding. And in fact, I'm going to describe in this section how it's actually problematic that there's such a large encoding set that's trying to represent so many different languages across so many different communities, and in fact, with so much typographic and orthographic variation. Because in fact, UCAS is a little bit misleading in the sense that it's such a large encoding map. However, if you look at this diagram or this illustration right here, you can see that across different languages that use the syllabics, there's a lot of orthographic and typographic variation in both the appearance of the syllabics, characters that are used, and in their functionality as well. And I'll describe that a little bit further. So even just performing a sweep of the historical documents that are available across the Northern Athabascan languages that use syllabics, or the Dacath syllabics, or the Cree, Inuktitut, or Ojibwe syllabics, you'll see a very noticeable graphic difference in the typographic appearance, but you also see orthographic differences as well, such as you'll see things like finals characters, those small superscript characters that I mentioned, being positioned at different vertical positions in relation to the baseline and the top line of the larger syllabics characters. If you look at the Dacath in the middle here, this is an example from the 19th century, a Dacath newspaper that was distributed throughout Dacath Nation in central British Columbia. You'll notice that their syllabics characters are uniform in height, and the finals characters are positioned at the midpoint between the baseline and the top line. And you can think about the top line as the cap height, just for a similar term. Whereas here in this example of Ojibwe syllabics from the 19th century, you'll notice that more or less these final characters, they'll sit up at the top line more. And also there are characters that are large syllabics characters that vary in terms of their size. So there are medium-sized characters and full-height size characters. Whereas on this side here, this Dene syllabics text, you'll see that they're also uniform in height. The style is different, and the finals characters have varying vertical positions in relation to the baseline. And these patterns matter towards the accurate representation for these communities in a contemporary context as well, in order for their syllabics to be represented in the way that they both need their orthography to work in digital text, but also the way that they identify with their writing system on a typographic visual level as well. So this analysis was conducted through a process of historical documents. I should note as well that all of this research work took place during the pandemic, which proved not to be as challenging as it might seem. Because of modern technology, it was possible to have Zoom calls, phone calls with people across Canada, which was great. And it was also possible to use library resources and digital library resources to view both historical and contemporary documents, such as these ones you see in front of you, which were great resources to see how contemporary communities use their syllabics, what their typographic preferences are. So in fact, we prepared an analysis that mapped out what these different preferences were, and we broke down the syllabics use into different syllabics traditions, or what I call different traditions. So the syllabics were first developed and used for the Algonquian languages, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe-Moin, as well as Nehiyawin or Cree languages. They were originally developed for Anishinaabe-Moin in southern Ontario around Peterborough, Rice Lake area, through a process of collaboration between missionaries and the local Anishinaabe people. And then they were implemented in a printing manifestation or a typographic manifestation at Norway House in Manitoba. And from there, they spread to the areas of Nunavik and Nunavut. So Inuktitut syllabics grew out of the Algonquian syllabics. And then they also spread westward, where they were used to print the Northern Athabascan languages. And from what I can tell, most of the Northern Athabascan languages today are using a Roman orthography, with some very limited syllabics use. But there is active use in the Dacath community of central British Columbia, and their syllabics, of course, growing out of the Dene syllabics a little bit later. And there's a historical Blackfoot syllabary that was developed based on the Cree syllabary, but it's not used anymore. by the local community. But this would be a visual representation of those preferences. You see the Algonquian syllabics, so Cree, Ojibwe, as well as Woods Cree, and also Inuktitut syllabics. This is an example of the Nunavik style representation of syllabics, where they have a variation between full height syllabics characters, medium height syllabics characters, and all of their finals characters are positioned at the top line. Whereas you see something like the Dacath syllabics, which is a branch of the Dene syllabics, and they're quite noticeably graphically different. And to a similar degree, the Dene syllabics being very visually different as well as orthographically different. So one of those major differences between the Dene syllabics and Dacath syllabics and the Inuktitut and Algonquian syllabics is the difference between what you see me describing, which is the round form style, which is an example on the left, and the square form style, which is the example you see on the right, where you see a difference in the shaping of the characters, but you also see a difference in their proportions. You could think of this like, I don't like to use the term case because there's no case in syllabics. However, you might think about it like they're uniform, unicase in height. So they occupy the same vertical space, whereas there's variation in height in the round form style. And if you go further into the Dene syllabics, it's critical to the orthographic representation of the phonemes in these languages for there to be a variation between where these smaller finals characters sit in relation to the baseline. So in some orthographies, there will be a difference between midline, baseline, and centerline positionings, or perhaps just a difference between the center line and the top line. It depends on the community and the dialect that's being represented, because these have to represent inflections in the language that can't just be represented by a pure consonant sound. And in some of the work that I conducted with the Dacath language keepers, Francois Prince and Dennis Kumplin, also led us to looking at the historical representation of the syllabics and trying to identify and get a consensus from the contemporary community as towards what their preferences were in terms of style. Because if you look at these documents, you see limitations in terms of type material. You'll see some larger, better representations of these documents that I'm showing you a snapshot of. But we were looking into and basically through Francois and Dennis, doing an analysis with the community to ask them, do you like this to look like a small serif Roman S, or would you prefer that it was harmonized with the structure of all of the other syllabic characters in the orthography? And we ended up identifying that they preferred this to be indeed harmonized. This was an artifact of having limited type material available, which makes sense given the context of where they were located and how difficult it was to get printing material to where they are, which is in present-day Fort St. James, the Nakasle area of central British Columbia. Okay, now some of the major work that we did that allowed us to even carry out the final fonts on the project was going to the digital text standards level for the syllabics, which was the UCAS representation that I showed you in this previous section. Something I want to just quickly say about working with any minority language and minority in the minority script or the writing system of these languages is that it's not like engaging in a process of type design for the Latin script. And I hesitate to just say the Latin script. I want to say languages such as let's say European or Western languages that use the Latin script that have a very stable platform, or writing systems that have a very stable digital text encoding. In type design like this, I can have a concept for a typeface or my typographic goal that I want to solve, and I can just open up my font design application and I can start drawing the characters, start figuring out the fitting of the design and shaping the design. But a project like this has to begin first with a process of research and community outreach, building relationships with the local communities in order to do a job that will actually deliver meaningful results for the community. Because otherwise I might be repeating mistakes that exist in the digital text standards already, and it doesn't allow the community to have it doesn't allow them to have a truly meaningful result, because they're just going to have the same mistakes repeated. Even if it's a beautiful typeface design within the context of that culture and their writing system, if the text doesn't behave properly across digital platforms, it's still not going to be very useful for people in their daily lives and their daily needs for using their language. So what we had to do is first identify what were the barriers that were being faced by these communities. And we did indeed identify that there were some communities that were missing syllabics characters, such as the Natchalik community of Western Nunavut, who speak the Natchalimeutut dialect of Inuktitut. So just to give a bit of context, the Natchalimeutut dialect of Inuktitut is a dialect that's in the far west part of Nunavut that you see marked here in turquoise. And in relation to the other dialects of Inuktitut, such as the dialects of Baffin Island region, as well as further north in the area, even the Western dialects of Inuktitut, it's actually, from a linguistic structure, there are additional sounds that Natchalimeutut requires that the other dialects don't have. And they require representation in their orthography in order for them to be able to accurately write their language. And just to provide a little bit of historical context, so I noted that Inuktitut syllabics derived from the Algonquian syllabics around present-day Moose Factory, Ontario. There was a press there that was printing Algonquian syllabics works, and the typeface that was being used for printing those Algonquian texts, so Cree and Ojibwe, was initially used to print the first works in Inuktitut syllabics. And it was commissioned from communities in Nunavik. And then from Nunavik, that spread up into the area that is Nunavut. And this is an example from the very late 19th century of a very well-developed Nunavik regional text in Inuktitut syllabics. And this, what's important is that this text was being the type was being supplied by Anglican missionaries, and it represents this round form style, which is now commonly used by all Inuktitut syllabics communities, including the Natchalik. However, the western part of Nunavut and the Natchalik communities their printing work was being conducted, or their type was being supplied by French Catholic missionaries in that area. And you notice that difference in style, which is more like those Northern Athabascan or the Dene syllabics. Now that's not really a huge deal, but what it just means is that Natchalimeutut was being printed in syllabics around the same time that all the Eastern dialects were as well. And all of these dialects were being perfectly represented, or mostly well represented, during this time of metal type printing and into the era of typewriter syllabics printing. But you'll notice here, this diagram gives you an example, and Natchalimeutut is linguistically, it's different enough from the other dialects, Eastern dialects of Inuktitut, that it has additional sounds. And so when I was conducting the initial research on the project, I noticed, just by going to the Wikipedia page for Inuktitut syllabics, I noticed here, I said, what's going on? Why are there these strange boxes? They don't even look like the typical not defined box that you'll see And of course, by reading the footnotes, I noticed, not yet in Unicode. And that immediately made me realize that there's a community here that's having technical barriers. And I then, doing just some very brief investigation, came across an article that discussed this dialect, Nachiling and Nilaulak, who I had the honor of working with during this process of getting the characters encoded. She actually worked to develop these new characters. So what I did was I reached out to the Présenté Center, and they connected me with Tamalik, as well as Nilaulak, and Atima and Ilahapi Hadlari, who couldn't even write their name in the way that it actually had to be phonetically represented. But these individuals are the key language keepers in the Naturally community who work on maintaining the orthography. So what we did was we identified the characters that were required and that were not in Unicode, and we prepared a proposal by first making a case for why they were needed. So you'll see here, the reason why these characters were not included is because of decisions made in the 1970s by the Inuit Cultural Institute, which was a linguistic body in Nunavut that proposed and developed a dual orthography system for syllabics and Roman orthography. And they did not include the 16 sounds that were needed for Nachiling Mutut. There is 4 of those sounds are actually already encoded for the symbols that they chose, but they were still missing 12 characters. The community was using a custom keyboard and font setup that was developed by Tiro Typeworks in British Columbia. And what they did is they used private use area codes. So those are not actual code points inside the Unicode Standard, but they can be used privately, as the name suggests. But they're not reliable code points if you want to use your language across digital text platforms and to store text and exchange it reliably. So we prepared a proposal by working together with the language keepers, as well as the community members, gathering evidence and materials to show the use of the characters. And on the 5th of October 2020, the Unicode Technical Committee accepted our proposal. And so that was a big step for the community, because what it meant is that the Unicode Technical Committee committed to ensuring that these would be published and made available in the Unicode Standard at some point. And we know now that on the 14th of September of this year, these characters were officially and formally published inside the standard. So what it meant is that our project contributed to the encoding of the syllabics, and essentially what we did was we proposed the characters that would be needed to make an actually comprehensive syllabics font in terms of the raw material, like the raw characters that were needed to represent all of the communities so that they could write their orthography. This community couldn't even write their entire orthography, the Naturally community. Now, the other community that I worked particularly closely with was the Daakath community of Central British Columbia. And there are many communities within the Daakath Nation, and as well as neighboring communities that also have a historical and some contemporary use of the syllabics, such as the Babine Wet'suwet'en communities, which are neighbors to the Daakath Nation, as well as the Tsikane Nation as well. Syllabics are still, they have fallen largely out of use in these communities, and there are revitalization efforts going on, which are being led by the language keepers, Francois Prince and Dennis Cumberland, who I had the privilege to work with on the Unicode proposal, as well as throughout the whole font design process. And what we identified with the Daakath syllabics is that the Unicode representation of the glyphs, which resulted in, let's say, system level typefaces or syllabics typefaces that did not accurately represent their writing system at all. This is a newspaper that I was mentioning earlier from the early 1890s. It was in circulation between 1891 and 1894, and it was called the Mission Papers. It was printed by a French Catholic missionary, Father Adrien Gabriel Maurice, who worked in conjunction with the local community members, especially in the Nakazle band in the Dakas Nation, to both develop the system and then also print the newspaper. And this is a memorial grave marker for Chief Kwa, with a translation into syllabics by Francois Prince. And so Francois does a lot of this work investigating the language from a historical perspective. What's important for the Dakas community in regards to them using their syllabics is that the syllabics are, because they were developed in the mid to late 1880s, they were developed at a time when the language was being spoken at without any interference from English or French, meaning that it was a pure form of the language. And this is how Francois described to me the importance of why they need to revive the use of their syllabics, but also to have it in an accurate representation in a way that, first of all, that it's readable, because the existing representation of the Dakas syllabics was not very readable at all for the community. But it represents that pure form of the language that they want to, that their goal is to achieve fluency across the entire community and through their language revitalization and preservation efforts. And the Dakas community, just like the other Indigenous communities across Canada that use syllabics, used the syllabics in everyday life. They use them to write letters. They use them for the newspaper. They use them for trail markers on both trade and travel trails. They carve them into trees. And so they had a diverse use and a vibrant use in the community. Now, the big difference is the example you see here. And especially if you look at forms, I don't know if my cursor is showing on this presentation, but you see things like, if you look at the top line, the fourth character on the top line, and compared to the same example on the bottom, you see big differences both in the height of characters, as well as in the shaping of characters, the vertical positioning of the finals characters, as well as the dot marker that you see on the top example floating up above the top line height. That marks the glottal stop, which is a sound like water in English. And that's very important to be easily read inside this language, for this language in its orthographic representation. So we identified that there were in fact these orthographic and representative glyph issues. And it appears that these issues were present from the earliest times of the Unified Canadian Aboriginal Syllabics Unicode encoding. If you look at both of these examples, especially the example on the right, the page on the right, you'll see that this looks quite a lot different than the example of the newspaper that I was showing you, which represents how the people expect their writing system to appear. And we're not just talking about a stylistic difference, we're talking about, it would be like having the letter G, lowercase, be squished between the baseline and the X height. It sort of looks like that. It looks very strange. And to someone reading in that, it's very disruptive to the flow of reading. It also does not look the way that the people wish their writing system to appear. So on many levels, it wasn't working for them. There were also issues in the Unicode encoding, the representation the correct orientation of characters, which matters to the inflection of the vowel that's being represented for the consonant syllable cluster. And what really indicated too for me, I found this online, and this is what led me to reach out to Francois in the first place. I said to Francois, I said, I was looking at the Unicode encoding for the DACA syllabics, and I saw your teaching materials, which is what this document is. And I said, this looks like the historical form that I've seen. And I said, this doesn't look like the system fonts that are available. And then he confirmed with me, yes, that we really need to have it changed because it's not the way that we wish our characters to be represented. And so we prepared a proposal that was successfully accepted in July of 2021 that didn't encode new characters rather, but sorry, the Unicode Technical Committee accepted our proposal for changing these characters. And in September, this coming September, these changes will be published in the new version of the standard. So some next steps. Now, it's a great thing that we were able to encode the new characters. And that was great. When we launched the project on the 24th of January, 2022, which was an exciting moment, you can see here that still Achima and Ilahapi, Elizabeth Hidler-Reed, they still couldn't write their name in a tweet. And I thought this was actually a really great example to make when we were launching the project, to say that our work here is still not done. We still have work to do because we can issue fonts as a font vendor, a font company, Typotex, which we've issued, and they're being very well received by the community. But if these changes at the Unicode standards level are not implemented on common system level typefaces like Euphemia or Noto syllabics, they're not implemented into the digital typesetting platforms, apps, etc. They won't be accessible to the community like you see here. So I continue to work with the Naturalite community as well as the DACA community to do this kind of work, where we're taking the results of our project and we're now working to get them implemented at these system level areas so that they can be used across the board. And so we prepared this document for the community to explain to them, this is sort of the process. It takes a bit of time, but eventually the characters will be available on common digital text platforms. Now, the work that we're continuing forward and doing for these languages that use syllabics is we're working on the Romanization, or the Roman representation, which in the case of the Athabascan languages, for example, there can be some complex glyph composition, decomposition rules that need to be defined. So diacritics that stack below the baseline, above characters, as well as characters from the IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet, or Americanist phonetic notation. Because even though it's 2022, this article, for instance, was published last month, I think, in CBC, and this is the Chipewyan language name being represented in a CBC article in the Roman orthography, which is the common orthography, but they require more complex glyph composition rules in order for these diacritics to stack on top of the I and below the I. And it's not being represented. So someone who's seeing this, who's a reader of the language, first of all, it's going to throw you off when you're reading, but also it's not an accurate representation of the language. And the thing about something like this is that it's completely avoidable because all of the technological infrastructure exists. So we're working to address things like that and make sure that our syllabics fonts support these Roman typesetting requirements. So it's things like this, making sure that the font can have something where you type an E in the diaeresis and then the acute accent can be stacked on top. which it must behave that way in this orthography. And so I'll just do a quick gallery of the fonts. Now, our fonts, the November Syllabics, which is an example you see on the top here, the Lava Syllabics, as well as the October Syllabics, which is a rounded version of November. These were the three main font type families that we released as the results of our research and text standards work. And we worked in collaboration with language keepers across the different communities to test our fonts during this process. So we were working with the Naturalique community and the Dakoth community in order to engage in work at the digital text standards level. But we also worked with the other communities to validate that we were getting their local typographic preferences correct, and that we were also building the fonts in a way where we could try to improve and make the best possible syllabics fonts. And we're still, now that we've released the fonts, we're still working not just on digital text standard work with the community, but we're also working to improve the fonts by addressing some local typographic preferences, for instance, in the Naturalique community, for their local syllabics representation, that we just didn't have a chance to get enough dialogue with the broader community in order to confirm those. And so we're working on it now, and we'll update the fonts once we can confirm all of those preferences. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to flip through here. And I want to get to the Q&A so that I have enough time to answer some questions. These are just examples of the fonts in use. Okay, so I'm going to come back into view here. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take a moment here to browse. And it's probably best.
All right. Can you see the questions on the chat, Kevin, because we've had a number of questions?
Yes, I see. So I've got, I'm going to the top and I'm going to just browse through.
I think Shay Harder's got the first question.
Mm-hmm. So for Shay, and please feel free, Shay, if you want to respond, please feel free to turn on your mic. We can have a discussion, and anyone else as well. So what you'll notice that from the example of the fonts that we released, we produced both what might seem like a monolinear style font, syllabics font, which is the common one that you tend to see. But we also developed a contrast syllabics font that has a secondary style, which was trying to look at different ways to expand the typographic palette of the syllabics, because there are really not a lot of options for syllabics users. And a lot of before I even got too deep into the project, a lot of the language keepers that I spoke to noted some issues with the fonts that they had available. And they did mention how it'd be nice to have more options for publishing. One thing I'll say is that the Lava Syllabics, which is the contrast version that you briefly saw, both the upright contrast version as well as the secondary style, which is more cursive in appearance, they've actually both been really well received by the different communities. They're especially interested in that for publication work. So there are not a lot of, and the difference really being that the Dakoth community, at first glance, you might say, well, this is a font issue, like a stylistic issue. But the problem with that is that it ended up being an orthographic problem, because in their orthography, they actually require all their glyphs to be at their uniform height and width proportion. They should be equal in width. And the shape of the glyphs were so different. It was like they were changed in a way where they weren't legible to people who are accustomed to reading in the writing system. So it wasn't something like a font stylistic issue. It was something that we had to address to make sure that common fonts that are available on cell phones and computers, not third-party fonts, would be represented accurately. Yeah. Okay.
Kevin, I'm wondering if we could actually read the question out so that people know what it is that you're responding to.
Okay, that's a good idea.
I know, are you at Hrant Papazian?
Yeah, Hrant, thank you. Okay, so I see two questions. What else? Okay, Hrant has two questions in terms of differing rendering traditions. What is the sweet spot of communities having their own identity versus a shared identity, the contrast with the dominant culture? So because there's such a large geographic scope, I think, with the communities, a lot of their traditions became kind of crystallized in the 19th century, and they have a lot to do with the type supply of that time. Now, for instance, Inuktitut communities, Cree and Ojibwe, could all use the same typeface more or less, as long as their orthographies were supported. And it would be in terms of identity, it would be fine, because they all share the same origin and they all accept the same pattern of how their syllabic should look. Whereas the Northern Athabascan and the Dakoth communities, they diverged so much and they have such different orthographic requirements that it's important for them. In fact, a really great comment that came up in the Unicode meetings where I was getting reviews on the proposals was that one of the members said that Dakoth, or carrier, as it's mentioned in UCAS, it should have been encoded as its own script. It's as different as Cyrillic is to Latin script. There are some similarities, but it is a different writing. It is a different writing system, and there are different people identify with it differently too. Okay, and then Hrant's second question, and also facilitating Romanized text, is there a risk that users will prefer its technical convenience, undermining the native script? That does happen. Even in Cree communities have a very strong pattern of using syllabics, but even in those communities, sometimes the Romanization, the Roman orthography, can be used over the syllabics. And that can have to do, I think that more or less has to do with technical barriers, though. But in Cree communities, there are really no technical barriers towards them using their syllabics in terms of how the orthography should work. I think that I think ideally it's important that we could facilitate both the syllabics and the Romanizations, as well as what I'm going to do is I'm going to segue into another question I saw, which was from Udo, which is how come that some tribes use syllabics and others not? Now, just for context on this, there are many Indigenous communities in Canada, as well as Northern United States, that use syllabics, but there are also many communities that use a Latin orthography, which have complex text rendering requirements. So like the Silesian languages and Wakashan languages of the Pacific Northwest, so British Columbia, as well as into the United States. Also Lakota and the other Northern Athabascan languages have complex shaping requirements. And some of them, I think it comes down to when their orthographies were developed in the 19th century, for the most part, they were developed in a way where they represented the languages really well on a phonetic level. And because the communities have such a long pattern of using them, I think that they identify with, either using syllabics or these beautiful Roman systems. And so it's really, I think it's a historical reason why some communities do. And it depends on the settler communities that were developing the orthographies and working with the communities, bringing in the printing equipment, etc. It's 8 o'clock. So what I'm going to try to do, I think I can take one more question. And I apologize that I can't. Well, actually, I think maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer Shay's question.
There's some similarities to some of the questions about global adoption versus community specific adoption. And I don't know if that would be what you would want to address, but I think rolling a few into one answer for our final question would be fine.
Yeah. Well, I think that what's important is the communities know what they need for their languages. If there's one thing that I learned from all the language keepers across the board, is that Indigenous peoples know very well what works best for their language. And the step between that and getting to a platform where their languages can have a vitality, and not just to survive, but also to be vibrantly used, has to do with providing a technical platform for them. And this would go for any minority language, I think. The communities know what they need. They need help navigating through the technical aspects in some situations, like the ones that we were identifying and addressing. And I think what's important too about the project that we engage in is that I developed really good relationships with the language keepers as well, in order to work with them, so that it wasn't just a process of me making assumptions, but I was really listening to what their needs were and following it through. And so we worked in collaboration together. Yeah. Okay.
Well, Kevin, is that your last word?
That's my last one. I gotta go. But
well, I'd like to just really thank you and to say thank you for the crash course in Indigenous syllabics, but also I think that what you've been doing with your group is bringing a robustness to Indigenous fonts that didn't previously exist, which is a milestone in the current Indigenous language revival. So that I'm hoping that this great intervention that you've initiated is going to continue and help in this respect. And I'm really appreciative of you speaking to us today.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you so much for having me come in and talk about the project. Thank you, Udo, Shay, Susan, and everybody, Jessica. And if you have any questions, please feel free. Thank you, Karen. Please feel free to write me at this. I'm going to enter my email. You can feel free to write me there or on Twitter. Thank you, Rand.
Is that visible in the chat, your email?
I think so. Oh, no, I think I wrote it directly. Sorry, Carl.
Have to.
I don't know how to.
You can tell it to me. I can put it in.
Okay, it's kevin@typotex.com. Thank you, Leah. All right. I hope you have a good rest of your evening, everybody. And look forward to sharing more later. Thank you, Robert.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good night, bye.
Good night.
Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you very much, Udo.
Thank you.
Good night. Good night. Thank you, Susan.